that are listeners, I'm a Gen Xer. So, I mean, I'm loud and proud about being a Gen Xer. A lot of people give us shit all the time about that. Excuse me, but those words will come out because I don't care. It's my show. I don't really care. So it's Mon and Diamond show. If we want to say something, we're going to say something. But no, that I grew up in a completely different like generation of thinking, like women's roles, women's rights. All of these things were very much a constant thing for us because we were not far removed from when the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, or even like the hippie movement. We were like, I was born in the early 70s. So there is a lot of things that I experienced and my family experienced that is very much part of my journey in my mental health, because mental health was not talked about when I was growing up. No one had mental health issues. Like we knew the guy down the street that did, that everybody gossiped about, over, Sunday afternoon dinner, but nobody in our families had mental illnesses. And so I grew up in the Midwest, and I was in a very conservative, religious, ultra conservative religious household. And I'm very thankful for my upbringing now that I know all the tools that I have and all those things. Like I know why I needed to be born into that family, why I chose that family, why I had to go through some of those situations, because I thought growing up my whole life was kind of idyllic, like we didn't really have a lot of things that could have been seen from outside as being problematic, but inside there was some problems, and we were all very good at masking. And so, being in my human design and my soul contracts and pretty much everything, I am an ultimate masker. And so like I grew up in a family where we were taught to mask. We were taught, like, as a 70s baby, going through we were taught to just put on these masks. We were always fine. We never showed our emotions, and that's all a bunch of crap, but we'll get to that in a different episode. And so, but also growing up as the preacher's kid. So there you go, listeners. I was a preacher's kid. Growing up as a preacher's kid, there were things that we didn't talk about that happened in our house or in our families or with people that we knew, because we just had to keep this persona to people. And I didn't think anything of it growing up. Like, I just thought it was normal. I thought everybody did this. And, we had wonderful people around us. And then we moved to a place in the South, and I'm not going to mention it because there could be some things with it. But we ended up having to deal with, in the mid to late 80s, we had to deal with some like racial tension that was very high. So much that the Klan got involved. So we'll just say that. We didn't stay in that environment because my family was threatened. And it was at that point in time when life for me mentally, that's when I started becoming very aware that things were not always connecting and not always working for me. But I didn't know how to express it because we just didn't talk about mental illness. I mean, my mom was undiagnosed growing up. And my grandmother was undiagnosed. Many of my family members were undiagnosed, but I could start seeing things weren't necessarily always correct with certain things. And here I am masking, talking like the jargon of the church. I did it. I heard myself do it. So, I still catch myself because I did it for so long. Like, there was this prim proper way that you even talked about people who had mental illnesses. But we always talked about the other person. We never really reflected on ourselves. And the phrase, and it still makes me cringe, God will take it away. You just got to pray it away. That, we'll get to that on a different episode, because I'm sure that will come up again. But that was one of those like things that I had to work through in my own life, even growing up, was that there was always a way out of me dealing with my own stuff. I could always pray it away. I could always not even explain that it existed, because for most people in religious settings, if it doesn't go away, there's something wrong with them, and they want to hide that. They don't want to be sinful, or they don't want to not be righteous or whatever. And so I remember in junior high, after this incident, there was a lot of things that started popping up with people around us, with my own family. And there was a lot of stories about my family that started coming to light. And they weren't necessarily bad things, but they weren't things that added up, like, and so I started like becoming more aware that people have more issues and I have more issues. And once we left and moved to a different state, like we literally picked up in like 2 weeks and moved from one state to another, left all of our friends, everything. And I couldn't talk to any of them. I couldn't say bye to any of them. Didn't understand why. I remember like that was the first time I really remember having like this depressive episode, like very much so, like that it was debilitating. Like I just stayed in my room and I read for days and days and days and really didn't talk to anybody. And my whole family did this. Like we were all very like anti communicative with each other or anybody else at this point in time. And rightly so by the situation that happened. But it was one of those things like I finally recognized, okay, and I didn't have terminology, I didn't have understanding, I didn't have words around it. I didn't know what depression even was. Like I'd never even, I don't know that I even heard of it, when I was in, my early teens. And then as I went through, junior high and high school, like more of these things started coming up, in science classes and, human anatomy. And then I ended up after high school, I went to nursing school. And that's when everything really became like about mental illness, became very open to me. And I was like, oh, wow, like there is this whole book of mental illnesses, I was like, oh, wow, because I had to buy the book. And so I had to buy all these books of different things. And so here I was, and I'm a 5'1". So everything you gave me, I wanted to research the heck out of it. And there was no Google. Well, there was starting to be kind of a Google at this point in time, but we only had books and libraries and, periodicals, and you might have microfiche. So if you don't know what that is, go look it up on Google. They can explain it to you better than I can. But, we would go look at all these things. And I remember studying and looking at all this stuff from a human perspective, like from a physical perspective, like chemically, how does it manifest? All of these things, like I was really like trying to figure out why. And I started to have words to what I was seeing. So I could see people's behaviors and patterns. And I was like, whoa, that's what that is. Like I wasn't the doctor physician, but I could see things, that were happening. And so when I started having language around it, that's when I really started understanding this whole mental illness. And, there was still things within my own family, like we didn't really talk about it. And we didn't really discuss it. And so, we didn't talk about things like that. I'm just going to say it. My mom all tried to commit suicide, and things like that. Those things were talked about in our family, but that trauma was held within in our physical bodies. And we'll talk about that on a later episode, but it was held there. And it wasn't until it was expressed, like, I physically understand how that it was held there. And I really didn't understand that until I was almost in my 40s, when I had terminology about the energetics of it. But I could see all of these things playing out with the people I was around, in the hospitals, in the clinics, and almost everybody had a diagnosis of depression at some point in time. And I actually thought it was kind of overused at some points in time with people. But then when it happened to me, I was like, yeah, maybe it's not so overused. And the first time I really, really experienced it after being in junior high, as I was always kind of that kid that I was like the fly on the wall kid in school. So I knew everything that was going on, and everybody told me everything about each other, but I didn't really tell anybody anything about each other. I just was the observer. And so I kind of flew under the radar all through school, but I was dealing with this kind of behind the scenes and just didn't tell anybody, because we weren't supposed to talk about it. We were supposed to pray it away. That's what we were supposed to do. And so in my early 20s, I spent about 3.5 years intentionally having no type of relationships, in dating relationships or anything like that, because I felt like there was some things I needed to fix within myself. And I was out of my family's home. I was living on my own. I was working, and I decided to go back to college to get a formal degree, because I'd gone and got a nursing license, but I wanted a degree. because I had also been told my whole entire life that I was going to be a nurse, a teacher, or a secretary. And none of those things seemed like fun to me, not even nursing, even though I ended up going into nursing. And the only reason I did was because I knew it would pay for college, like your military experience. And so I did that because back then, nurses could make pretty decent money. And so I went that route, but I wasn't happy. Like I enjoyed some aspects of nursing, but I didn't enjoy it at all. Like I had no fun doing some of the things that I did, and especially the constant politics behind it at that time in nursing. That really, I mean, it really drained my energy. Now I know that, like, it completely would just drain my energy, but there were certain parts of it that really like energized me, like being with the patient. I had fun with that. But when I had orders and I had to do this and that stuff, I did not like doing. And I realize now that I was preparing me not to work for anybody is what I was realizing, but I was also battling depression, and I was battling anxiety and panic attacks. I was having constantly, but nobody knew about it. I didn't tell anybody about it. I was dealing with it all on my own. And I went all the way through college, got married, had my first kid, and it hit me terribly hard. After my first kid, I had such severe postpartum depression that I had to be put on medications. I had to talk to somebody. It lasted for like 2.5, 3 years, like this constant depression. And so after I had my first child, when I started understanding that I was having kind of these ebbs and flows, and I was having more ebbs than flows, like I was like, do I have something else going on? So I started exploring that. And for me, it ended up being just depression and anxiety and panic attacks. But over the years, there was things that kept making it worse and worse and worse. And it wasn't necessarily things that I was doing in my life. It wasn't having kids. It wasn't, even though I had some like mental health, depression and postpartum, but it was things that kept popping up from early childhood, like things I would remember, or we would have a conversation around the dinner table and they would go, oh, didn't you know so-and-so had this? And I was like, it would trigger things in my mind. And so in my mid to late 30s, I was really struggling even with what I thought and I believed about myself, because I actually went into what I consider an identity crisis, because I was like, I have been following this path with these people for most of my life, and I don't even know if I think or believe like any of them. I don't know if I still want to be a part of this community that says this, but I'm not feeling this. Like energetically, it was not meshing, and I was struggling. And my husband and I worked in nonprofits, and we worked in churches and things like that. And we kept having these constant like conflicts. And it wasn't like personality conflicts, but it was more conflicts like, do we really think that way? Or do we really believe that way? Are we really going to teach this that way? Because I don't know if I align with that. And I don't know if I agree with that. And it became a really hard struggle for my husband and I. And we kind of knew we were coming to an end of it, but we didn't realize the end was like actually severing the tie. And my whole identity, my whole life, my whole personality was wrapped up in my mask of being a preacher's kid and working in the church. Everything were all revolved around that. I had no idea who I was. And let me tell you, talk about going into the worst state of depression for like 3 years that I could ever go into. And so I hit a place, and I was like meditating. I'm going to say I was kind of meditating. Let's just put it that way. I was kind of meditating. I started reading, like certain, like there were certain kind of like books and stuff that I read, watched, I forgot what that show is. It's on Netflix, but I'll think of it. It's like the entry show that everybody watches that gets into like the spiritual community. But what was more interesting to me is there was certain, like I loved watching televisions and dramas, and I'm big into like animes and not sci-fi, but like I just lost the word in my head. I'm thinking of too many things. Like Marvel characters and stuff like that. Like I was really into that at the time. And I had little kids and they were all into that. And so we were having fun. And there was a television show that came on and she brought up a scripture in the episode. This was an episode and it was brought up the scripture. And I will never forget it because it was talking about the Nephilim. And I was like, wait a second. I've read the Bible like 100 times by now. I've taught it. I've sat under people for, 30s plus years. Why have I never heard of this? Like seriously, why? And that to me was when like all heck broke loose, physically, mentally, and emotionally for me, because I called on my husband, who is trained in biblical theology. I called on my dad, who's trained in biblical theology. I called on like 3 or 4 other people I knew, and I was like, why is this never talked about? And they're like, because we don't understand it, so we don't talk about it. I was like, what? My 5'1" goes like berserko. I'm like, well, now I got to understand it. So that was kind of my entry point, but it was also my most unstable point in my entire life because I was so emotionally and mentally unstable, and I was trying to mask every day just to function. And I went like that for several years, and my own idea of finding answers was actually almost to my detriment. And so I want to share with our audience that sometimes, even if our own human design or soul contracts lead us on a path, because that's just our human nature and who we are, sometimes it can be really good and sometimes it cannot be. And for me, I was almost obsessive about finding answers and proving people wrong and finding why I was so right. And in that, it mentally affected me greatly. And so I went through a health crisis, and that added even more stress onto it, to the point that one day I did not want to get out of bed, and I did not want to last to the end of that day. I was done. I was over. I was ready to check out. I didn't want to be here, and I was over it. Like I was over life. And my husband had enough knowledge and wisdom to get me committed. Like that's what he did. So I spent a very short time, but I spent some time, because they kicked me out because they said I was the most like mentally healthy person they'd ever met. And I was like, well, good, because I just calmed you. And they knew who I was. And I told them that. I was like, I can totally make you believe that I am perfectly healthy when I'm not. And the therapist that I worked with, she was always really funny about it, because she's like, so am I talking to Rachel today or the other Rachel today? Like that's literally like she put me in 2 different places. Like my mask was one person and I was the other. And I thought I was losing my whole sense of reality at this point. And I had to go through a lot of work, and I had a lot of misdiagnoses. So that was what really, really was the catalyst for my mental health. I literally, I tanked. And when I realized that I couldn't continue to function like this, because every time I went to see a new doctor or therapist, they gave me more pills, and I was functioning on anywhere from, 12 to 15 pills a day just to live my life. And I was like, this is not living life if I got to take a pill just to have a conversation. That was the point I was at. And so I began seeking out a few things on my own, because I knew that I needed to do something different. We had already made the transition out of religion into finding our own path in how that was going to look. We had already decided, we had a job and things like that. And then my husband left that position and went into sales, which was completely funny, because neither one of us wanted to do sales, and voila, we both have businesses. We sell all the time. And so I think, the cosmos' way of being funny. But it's one of those things, like I knew I needed to make some changes. And so I had been meditating, and taken a meditation class. And so I really got into that. And that was really helping. But then I knew I needed to get off the medication, because with my background in nursing, I had done medical research. I had done all these different things in my nursing career. And I was like, I can't keep going this path, because I'm going to get sicker and sicker and sicker. And I'm going to get so sick that there is nothing that they can do to help me. And so I went on kind of this no research. I literally had to tell myself not to research things. And I was like, but I have to find some alternatives. So I just kind of let the universe do whatever the universe wanted to do at that point. And I had three very beautiful serendipitous encounters. One was with a medical intuitive. That was the first one. And she literally looked at me and said, "This is what I'm supposed to tell you. And you're going to have to go figure it out on your own, because God told me that if I told you the answer, you wouldn't believe me. But if you go research it, you'll know that." She knew nothing about me. Like, she'd only knew what God told her to tell me. And so I was like, okay, cool. Like, yeah, I don't like you at this point, because it honestly pissed me off, because I'm like, well, give me the answers. Because like I was in no research mode. Like, I can't go find it. And I was like, well, I'm going to have to like look at certain things. Well, it was interesting because people were sending me emails that had information that I was looking for, or I would watch a movie and it would say something. I was like, wait a second, that has to do with, and I started getting terminology for what I was experiencing and what I was starting to kind of enlighten myself in this different space. And so then I got onto plant medicine, and that was the biggest change for me ever. Very much like your clinical trials. I knew I didn't want to be on the medications that I was on. I knew I needed to find an alternative. And I was like, I can go extreme. I live in Arizona, so you can go all kinds of plant medicine out here if you want to, or you can kind of go the middle of the road. And so with my past being my past, going the extreme was not an option, because my family was like completely opposed to that. And I thought, well, I'll just try a few things out. So I kind of did a little checking on it. But I went to a meeting one day, and this lady walks up to me and says, "Hey, I want to connect with you. We both had kids the same age, da, da, da." And I ended up finding out about plant medicine. And so I started taking that. 6 months later, I took my last pill, and I'm not taking a pill since. But I do take my plant medicine every day, and various types of it now. I like, several different types of plants that I take on a daily basis, that helped me understand how to cope in the physical, because having a nursing background and then totally shifting your mindset to only plants from pills was the biggest like logical thing I had to overcome, because I thought Western medicine pills, and they do have their place. So I'm not knocking that. So don't come at me in the comments, but because they do have their place. But for me at that time, they did not have a place. They were going to be my demise. And that's the way I felt. And so when I found plant medicine, I was like, wow, this is very life-changing for me. And it did. It changed my whole physical health. I was able to get the toxins out of my body and all that kind of stuff. But I knew I needed somebody to talk to. I needed somebody that was not in the religious space, that wasn't in the medical space, that wasn't even in like knew me. I wanted somebody completely cold turkey. And I had asked Source, very much like about the podcast, I said, give me a vision of who I'm going to meet. And I knew the location where I would meet this person, because I saw the building, but I didn't know the building. Like, I saw the vision of the building, but I didn't know the building, and I saw the vision of the person. And this person was like Viking tall, and bleach blonde hair, and stood out like completely from everything. And I knew like it was very specific, very much like with you. It was very specific, and there were certain things, like I knew the color of her sign and the color of her tablecloth, and I mean, like, weird things, but I really couldn't see her face. Like, I just knew all these aspects. And so I got invited to an event, and I had not attended events for quite a while, because I just mentally, like, I was tired of faking it. That's where I really got to. I was really tired of going to events and being happy and cheery and telling everybody I was okay, when I went home, I was not okay. Like, I would barely make it through without having to take some other medication so that I could stave off a panic attack or an anxiety. And I was tired of hitting these walls constantly of I'm just lying to people. That's what I really got to emotionally, was that I was lying to people constantly. And I did go to the event, and I did meet the woman that became my coach for like 3.5 years. And that was when I first got to be honest with myself, was when I sat with her. And I was one of those people, like, I didn't want to take my time in doing this process. I was like, let's just peel back all the onion layers, which I don't advise for most people, but I wanted to find the crux of the issue. And I wanted to get to the root cause. I thought it would only take me like 3 to 6 months. Years later, I'm still working on it, and I will always be working on it. But it was one of those things, like, I needed somebody to be a catalyst that was there to keep giving me language around what I was learning and experiencing, but also there to like hold me accountable for what I was growing and I was learning in, because it's so easy to default to the mechanisms that you used before. And it was so easy for me to mask and lie to people around me that I was okay, and I really wasn't. It was really easy for me to just kind of blend into the wall like I did in high school, and not really like step out into my true self and who I was. And I needed somebody to kind of hold me to this process. So I really kind of went hard the first like 6 months, like every week I was in there. So I wouldn't advise that, but I had the space at the time to be able to do that with where my family was and stuff like that. And I'm super grateful with that, but it didn't come easily. Like, I still had periods where I was finding what really was causing the anxiety, what was really causing the panic attacks, what was really causing the depression. And when I found out what was at the root of that, I would find there was another layer to it. And I was constantly finding this next layer to it. And I was going through this process, and I realized that this was a lifelong process. This was going to be a completely ongoing process. And the things that I discovered about myself, like sometimes I had to go back and I had to ask, like something would pop up in my memory, and I'd have to go back and ask, like, did this really happen? Because I didn't like remember it. And so I'd have to go back and ask my parents or my sister, or, somebody that was involved with it. Cause like, I didn't remember it the same way that the vision was. And, sometimes it was positive, sometimes it was negative, sometimes it meant nothing, sometimes it meant a whole lot. And it was such a beautiful process, but a very humbling process, especially for somebody who wants to mask all the time. And it also gave me the tools. That was the thing, is she encouraged me to find different tools. Like, I had my human design generated. Like, I went on, I did very much like you did. I went and put it in, and then I went on YouTube and did all that kind of stuff. I did that, and I got into Gene Keys, and I got into Dolores Cannon, and I got into, auras, and I got into all these things. And I found like certain things for me worked, and then other things were valuable tools to have in my toolbox for people, but they weren't necessarily the things that resonated with me. And then the final piece for me in my mental health, because I still think that there are times where I deal with it, not as much as I used to, but when I came to the acceptance that my soul chose this journey, and I accepted the fact that I chose my parents, I chose some of the karmic things that I brought into this life, and some of the talents that I had. When I learned all of those things and I accepted that, that was when life changed for me. Because I was like, now I look at, even when I do have times where I want to mask, or I want to stay inside and not talk to anybody for a long time, and people would say that's depression. I look at it, okay, how am I learning? What is my soul? What's the soul journey now? And what am I taking myself on? And what am I supposed to glean from this that I'm supposed to teach other people? And for me, that's been the journey with mental health for me, is now accepting the fact that I'm not going to pray it away. I will use the tools and the knowledge that I have in order to understand why this is part of my journey, accept that it's part of my journey, and what is the lessons that I need to learn when I'm in some of those states of being depressed, or when something causes me anxiety. Now I know, like, it's energetic. So when something is causing me anxiety, it's probably something around me is about to happen with somebody, or like, I now understand that it's more of a registering and an awareness that something's happening than the manifestation that this is, I'm having a panic attack or I'm having anxiety, because these things are happening to me. now they're happening around me and I can sense them and I understand them. So for me, mental health has been kind of this weird dichotomy and journey of we never talked about it to now I find that it is, in my opinion, part of my superpowers. And I know that it's part of my superpowers because it's part of my story and it's part of my journey. And to know that I went from a place that was so almost painful in the way people talked about it, and to now being able to accept it and accept the people around me that have these illnesses or these journeys as well, that I can go, hey, what's their superpower in this? Because like I see your bipolar being your superpower, because I can't talk to people about being bipolar, but you can. And so that's part of your superpowers. And so that's the way for me, that's been my journey with mental illness and how I've evolved with that over my lifetime. So that's kind of my story, and I'm sticking to it.
I love that so much. Like, I've heard part of your story like prior, but hearing it all in one like sitting, it's like, wow. It's funny because I'm getting to the point where as you speak, I actually see like different parts. I'm pretty sure it happens with me too, with but I see different parts. One one thing that I feel like is going to be an exciting conversation one of these episodes is the link between like the mental health diagnoses and the way that conditioning affects like the way you show up. Like even like the more that I understood that I'm an emotional and I live life in waves, I'm like, but that's bipolar. Bipolar like apparently live their life in waves. So it's like one of those things with like your depression, you have a lot of mental energy. And the people that I know who have a lot of definition up there, I wouldn't know. I don't have that. And I see now.
Fine. I've got a lot there. So
I see now that it's a gift sometimes because I wasn't seeing it that way. But in knowing people who have that mental energy, it does show up as depression because one of the centers up there is the crown center, and it's this pressure to think. And we live in a society that so much praises logical thinking, and then you start to like fight yourself. It's like, well, society tells me that thinking is good, but my thoughts are hurting me. So
there.
so what does this mean?
Well, and so much of our scripting comes from, and this is something we'll discuss in a later episode, I'm sure. But for a long time, like I blamed everybody else for my mental problems. And then I realized, wait a second, I chose my parents, I chose my sibling, I chose the circumstances that I was born, and I chose the time I was born, and all that wonderful stuff. My soul chose that for me. And if they're to blame, then what's my responsibility? There was none. And that was for me. This is only for me. So all the religious people, don't come after me. But for me, praying it away was saying, okay, somebody else is going to fix this externally and not me working with source energy to fix myself. And I don't even necessarily think I need to be fixed. I just have to figure out now within my own mental capacity what I have to do to be aligned in doing that. So even like the way I sit and my posture, and like when I get to overthinking, I think of one of my mentors, his name is Nicholas. He always tells me, Rachel, sit back in your seat and stop leaning forward with your head. Like, because I'm constantly, and he says that is a physical indicator of people who have that, part of their head and their human design is that because they're mental. We're totally cerebral. And I have to really like take that back and go, you know what? I live in a human body and I have emotions and I have to tap into those things. But I find that now that's a superpower for me, like not trying, but working to see when I do those things and how I can help. And I recognize it in people all the time. I'm like, oh, like I just know it. Like I can feel it with people. Like they're just like me. And so, which is interesting because we talked about our charts. So for our listeners, when we say charts, I do soul contract readings. Diamond does human design readings. We both are into gene keys. So if you don't know any of that stuff, we're going to teach you about that as we go through our episodes here in the future. But these are all tools and mechanisms that we've used to learn more about ourselves and who we are in different aspects. And so when it's interesting because Diamond and I have, like I think I said in the first episode, that we have the same sun sign. We probably all the other signs are too, but maybe a little bit different because our dates are different. But we are 5-1 in our human design. A lot of our soul contract numbers are very similar, just in different placements. And so it makes us very alike in a lot of things, but our aspects of certain things are different. I'm like, one of us is very like earthbound and one of us is not. But we in our logic, we're very similar. And I find that super interesting. And so for the listeners that are listening to us, I hope that our stories, one, have inspired you to just, really sit back and just know that sometimes the things that we in society view as not superpowers can be your superpower. So just putting that out there. Two, that mental illness is a journey. We're never going to be off of it, or it's, but that's part of who we are. That's part of our story. My story wouldn't be as interesting if I didn't have depression or anxiety or panic attack. And now I see a lot of those things when I go and reflect on them, they're also spiritually connected. A lot of those times when those things happen, because I didn't have verbiage or I didn't have awareness around them. So I wasn't able to see it correctly. So that's what scared me. That's what caused my body to have the reaction it did. So now when I see certain things, or like when visions pop up in my meditations, they don't freak me out. I'm like, oh, this is great. And my energy aligns with that. So I want our listeners, and if you do have a mental illness, please, please, please see a professional first. and be correctly diagnosed and all that kind of good stuff. I'll put that disclaimer out there. But also, this is part of your journey. So your self-discovery, your self-learning, your self-awareness, and your self-realization is also part of that journey. And so wherever you're at on your mental health journey, I just want to encourage you to keep pushing forward. I want you to keep knowing that you have support. So if there's something that you're dealing with, or you're interested in human design or any of the other things, or you're like, what the hell are these women talking about? Stay listening or reach out to us, because our information will be in the show notes. But there are people out here who are advocating for people to enjoy this journey. It's not always enjoyable, but the journey is the journey, and that's your story. So we want our listeners to follow us, to keep listening to our stories, keep listening to our dialogue, keep listening to, the days that we don't really, because I'll be honest, when I woke up this morning, I was like, man, how do I cancel today? Like, seriously, that was because I'm in a masking phase but I'm also like, okay, why am I masking? Like, what? But I knew I was sharing my story. And so there's parts of it that are not pretty, they're kind of ugly. And do I want to share that? And I am fine sharing it. But then there's some days where I'm just kind of like, do I really want to share it today? Like that. And that's kind of how I was this morning. I'm being completely honest, pulling the mask off. Like, I was like, how do I get out of this session today? Like, I didn't want to. Part of me didn't want to, but part of me did. And I was like, why? Because if it would have been 10 years ago, I'd have just canceled on you. I just wouldn't have done it. But now I'm like, why? Like, I ask those questions, why? Why do I feel that way? Why am I wanting? And I was like, it's my sevens in my chart masking. It's my, head up here my logic getting in the way. So I want our listeners to understand that we're on this journey with you together. We're all experiencing very similar things. We're just at different spots. And we just want to be there to support you on this journey. And so if you would like to speak with either one of us, or you have questions about any of the tools that we talked about today, we hope that you will connect with us in the show notes. Our information will be there, and stay tuned for the next episode, because I'm sure it's going to be interesting. So thank you all for listening. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Oh, the balloons.